Hi, it's Jan Hal. Welcome to my channel where I show you tips and tricks for all your DIY sewing, crafting, and home projects. I'm going to show you how you can make a waterproof baby changing mat. It's a simple, straightforward sewing tutorial, a great project for beginners. This changing mat is waterproof. It's the perfect size that you can fold up, throw in your diaper bag. They're easy to wash and really easy to make. And they make really fun baby shower gifts. Stay with me for the whole video because I'm going to show you two different techniques that you can use to finish the edges. I'm going to show you how to apply double fold bias tape with a mitered cornered edge, which really adds a classy look to the changing mats. And if you've been intimidated by bias tape and haven't applied that yet, I'll show you how easy it is to do. After watching this tutorial, I hope that you'll find that it's really easy and it does add a lot of charm to your projects. In a previous tutorial, I showed you how you can make your own bias tape. Well, this is the perfect project to use those techniques and apply it to these changing mats. And of course, I'll show you how to add a custom tag if you want to. Let me show you how easy they are to make. Let's go over the materials and items that you'll need for this project. Of course, you're going to need some fabric. We're going to use a waterproof type of fabric that's called POL. It stands for polyurethane laminate. It's a fabric that has one side that's woven and one side that's plasticky and waterproof. You can find this online. You can find this at most fabric stores. Sometimes they'll have prints, but most likely you'll just be able to find a white, which is just fine. I'll put the link in the description below where you can get some of this. You'll need a fabric for the front of the mat. You can use flannel, you can use a quilter's cotton print, and you'll also need a lining fabric for the middle. I like to use an iron-on fusible fleece fabric, but you can use just a regular piece of flannel. I like to use white or a neutral color that won't show through onto the front. You don't want to put holes in your polyurethane fabric, so I recommend using fabric clips. These are wonderful if you don't have a set. They're not very much money, and I will put the link in the description below where you can get these. They will come in handy for so many other things as well. To cut out your fabric, I like using a rotary cutter, a ruler, and a mat. It just makes it so you can get those straight lines. Of course, you can use a pair of fabric scissors as well. One of the methods we'll be using is applying a double fold bias tape. And if you haven't watched my tutorial on how to make your own printed, cute bias tape, you might want to watch that. I will be also showing a method and a technique that you don't need to use bias tape that is really simple. You'll need a turning stick. And if you want to add a custom tag, have those handy. I have a tutorial showing you how easy these are to make as well. You'll need your sewing machine, an iron, and an ironing board. When you buy the POL fabric, it comes in on a bolt that's really wide, like I think almost 60 inches wide. So you can make several of these if you buy a half of a yard of the POL fabric. You'll also need a half of a yard if you're buying fabric by the bolt, or you can use some of your scraps. The rectangular pieces that you'll be cutting out will be 25 inches by 18 inches. So go through your fabric and see if you have some pieces that you can use. You'll also need a piece of fusible fleece, or you can use a piece of flannel like I mentioned before. So you'll cut that to the same size. So you'll have 3 pieces of fabric that will be sewing together. And if you are going to apply bias tape, you'll need about 2.5 to 3 yards of double fold bias tape. The first thing that we'll do if you're using fusible fleece is to apply that to the back side of your front piece. Now, to tell the difference between the fusible part and the non-fusible part, you want the fusible part, which has little bumps, a bumpy texture on it. You'll want to place that down on top of the back side of your fabric. I'll go to the ironing board and do that now. It seems to work better if I have the bumpy side facing up and then I put my flannel piece on top and press through that. One thing to mention though is you do not want to iron on any of the fusible fleece directly on that bumpy side, or the sticky stuff will get onto your iron. And I do have a tutorial if that happens, showing you how to get that off really easy, because it happens. So I'm going to make sure those edges are lined up. One thing I did not mention is some people might think that you can use a cotton batting for the center, but batting is meant to be quilted. It might separate when you wash it and not work as well. I use this fusible fleece in a lot of my projects, my zipper bags and my zipper pouches and things. It's really nice. If you are wanting to add a tag to the mat, this is the time to do it. Decide which is the top of the mat. If you have a directional fabric like these cats, you'll want to make sure that you are placing the tag in the right place. If it's just a random print, you don't have to worry about this. But we're going to measure 3.5 inches down from the top of the mat and mark it with a pen inside the seam allowance. If your tag has a direction, like this love tag that I have made, obviously if we don't want that upside down, not a big deal, but we'll want to center the tag with that line, especially if you're making several for the same person. You want the tag to be in the same place on all of them. Not critical, but if you want to do that. So I'll find the center, I'm going to slide it in. The cut edge of the tag will be along the raw edge of the fabric. My seam allowance is going to be just about there, so I'm going to clip that in place, take it to the sewing machine and just baste on the inside about 1/4 inch from the edge. Now I know it seems, oh, I'll just clip it in place and then sew it, not take the time to baste it. But every time I do that, it shifts a little bit and your tag won't be straight. Take the time to go to the sewing machine and baste that in place. You'll be glad you did. Now we're ready to make our fabric sandwich and sew it all together. If I were using the flannel lining, I would place that on the table, place the front piece on top of that with the wrong side facing down, and then take your pull fabric. Determine which side is the waterproof side. So if you look really closely, you can see that this side has a pattern to it. It's like you can see the weave of the nylon fabric. And on this side, it's going to be more shiny and a little bit more plasticky looking. So I'm going to place that side facing down. Line up your edges and clip it in place. Now, something you may not know about these little clips is there's a rounded side and a flat side. The rounded side, if you'll slip that underneath your fabric, it slides in and under really quickly and easily. If you use the flat side, sometimes it bunches up the fabric and is a little more difficult to apply. So just a little tip there. See how slick they slide underneath the fabric. This first basic method, you'll be sewing around the edge and flipping it right side facing out and then top stitching. Really simple. And so we need to leave a portion of the rectangle open and unsewn so that you can turn it inside out. I like to use a red clip to mark where I need to stop and start to leave that opening. It just helps me remember. And that opening is 4 inches wide. Let's go to the sewing machine, start here, sew all the way around and backstitch. Bring along your little box or whatever you keep your clips in to have that at the side so that you can put them in as you take them off the fabric. I'm using a straight stitch and the edge of my presser foot. This is just my regular presser foot and it'll be 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew to the corner, stopping 3/8 of an inch from the edge. Leave my needle down, lift up your presser foot and pivot, and continue sewing all the way around. There's my red clips, so I'm going to stop there. And backstitch. You want to clip the corners. Find your opening, right side, and then stick your hand in and pull it out. This is where you'll take the turning stick and poke the corners out. Take it to the ironing board. You do not want to press the whole fabric. It will melt. And this opening that you left unsewn, just fold the edges up, the same seam allowance. Just play with it a little bit, flatten it out just where you need to, and put some clips on there. Another thing to mention is you don't want to get the iron on your label. It will melt that as well. Okay, now we're ready to top stitch all the way around. I'm going to start just on the outside of that opening, 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and sew all the way around. My presser foot has 2 little red lines on it. I'm going to use that to guide my top stitching. I'm also going to change my stitch to a little bit longer stitch from a 2.5 to a 3. It just looks a little bit better for top stitching. And also just a note, if it's been a while since you've changed your needle, you might want to do that. It does make a difference in your projects to have a fresh needle, especially top stitching. And when you're top stitching, a little tip so that you don't have the threads bunching up and that extra thread on top, all tangled kind of at the top, is to hold that top thread the first couple stitches, and then that will prevent that from happening. You can also put a piece of painter's tape right here as a guide for that 1/8 inch seam allowance. This tape really helps your eyes not get so strained. Clip your threads. No bunched up threads. Isn't that a cool little trick? Okay, there's the first method. Wasn't that simple? Let's start on the second method, which is applying a mitered corner bias tape. For this mat, I have chosen this cute orange polka dot. I have made this striped bias tape. Now, won't that be cute? I'm going to show you what it would look like to just use a regular piece of flannel. This is a piece of flannel that was a sheet that I no longer need. It's a flannel sheet. It's a good quality fabric, and I use it a ton for things. So this will be the perfect project for it. It doesn't matter whether it's right side facing up or down, but I'm going to place that down on the table first. Place the front fabric with the wrong side facing down onto the flannel. Line up the edges. So we're just making our little fabric sandwich again. Take the tulle fabric, find the shiny side, place that face side down onto the front piece. And I am going to add a tag to this one as well. So I'm going to measure down that 3.5 inches on the right side. I think I'll use this cute With Love rabbit tag. And I have the link of where you can get these love labels. I'll put that in the description below. Clip it and then baste it in place. Now for this method, we're going to put the fabric sandwich together just a little bit differently. The pull fabric will be placed on the table first. I am putting the plasticky side facing down your lining piece, or if you have applied the Fusible fleece, that will be connected to this already. Place the 3 fabrics together, line up all the edges, and then clip it in place. I like to flip it over and see if there's any bulk, because you don't want these wrinkles in it, and you want the edges to be lined up. And if you have to trim off some of the edges because they're not lining up, you'll want to do that. And that's not a big deal, because when we're cutting out these pieces, it's easy to get them not exact. And this is a little bit of an extra step, but I am going to take it to the sewing machine and use a basting stitch and sew around the edge at about 1/4 of an inch, just to keep it stable while we put on the bias tape. I have basted all the way around. Now we're ready to apply the bias tape. We're going to apply it to the back side first, and then it will wrap around to the front, and then we'll top stitch it. We'll start in the bottom or the top edge, you know, just eyeball about where the center is going to be. And you're going to leave about a 6-inch tail. And we're not going to start sewing here. We'll start sewing down about 3 inches from that center point. I'm going to pin that in place just so I know where I'm going to start. I don't clip all the way around, because I just sew, hold it, and ease it in as I sew. I just find you're adjusting it anyway. You'll bring the right edge, so obviously we're putting the bias tape right side facing down onto the fabric. We're lining up the edges, and we'll start sewing in that crease right there that we have pressed when we made the bias tape. These strips are 2 inches. I don't press that center, because I find that it just causes problems when you're sewing it on. It kind of has a mind of its own if it's already been pressed. This way you give a little bit, there's a little bit of flexibility in the bias tape. This mat, we're going to use a mitered corner method that really looks nice. I'm not going to cut my bias tape. You can, if you want to, like, estimate how much you'll need and then cut. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to sit that by my sewing machine, because there have been times when I've cut it too short, and then that's not a good situation to be in. I have changed my sewing machine settings back to a 2.5 stitch length, and will sew down that first crease, back stitching at the beginning of the seam, and stop a 1/2 inch away from the edge. If you want to, you can take a pencil and just mark that point where you need to stop. You'll sew down to this point, leave the needle down, lift up your presser foot, and sew at an angle to the point. And then I'll show you what to do. Just pivot the fabric, and you can kind of see where that point is. Just sew off. And flip your fabric around, leaving this edge folded. Flip it up, and then flip it back over onto itself, lining up those edges. And you'll also be lining up the top of the fabric with the fold of your bias tape. Align the edge with the edge of the fabric there, and just start sewing down that crease again. You don't have to back stitch. You don't want to pull the bias tape tight, just let it lay on top. And continue sewing to the other corner. Make sure when you come to the seams of the bias tape that the seams are open and flat. We're coming to that corner again. I'm going to mark that 1/2 inch point. Flip it up like that. Flip it back down. Make sure those edges are lined up and the top edges are lined up. Start sewing down the crease again. Make sure the bias tape is loose, not pulled tight. I'm getting back to where I started. I have this tail. This is about my halfway point. I want to extend this piece of bias tape out a ways as well. So I'm going to cut that about 3 inches from that center point. I'm going to back stitch first. I'm going to mark somewhere in the middle there, just a little line. I'm going to bring my one piece over and mark where that line is. And then I'm going to bring this piece over. I'm not pulling it, I'm just letting it lie nice and flat without pulling it. And find where that line is and also mark it on this top piece. I'm going to take a ruler, or I'm using just the edge of my seam gauge there, and I'm going to draw a line. I'm going to open up that fold. Draw a parallel line there, and then draw a line This is why we leave that unsewn area. I'm going to find those lines, bringing the right side of the bias tapes together, lining up the lines. Let's see that. And you can use a pin here. Open up the folds and sew right down that line. Before I cut off those extra pieces, I'm going to let it lie flat and see if that's the correct distance, and it fits perfectly. Then you'll just cut away 1/4 inch from the seam and finger press that open. And fold that, finger press that top edge again. And now we need to sew that gap. Just come back up, start where you left off, back stitch. Overlap where you ended off there a little bit and back stitch. So flip it over and see how that has a nice mitered corner. This is where the clips come in real handy. We're going to fold that folded edge over the top, and we want to make sure that it's going a little bit past that seam line and clip it in place. Now for the mitered corner, fold it, and then we're going to fold the other side. Make sure that that is folded to the edge, and then flip it. This is where I do like to clip all the way around. See how I'm folding just past that seam line, so we don't want to see that when we top stitch the other side. So if there are places that don't quite fold over and cover the seam, you may need to open up your bias tape a little bit, that fold, and increase that a little bit, and then press it. Just kind of have to tweak it. You know, all bias tapes aren't perfect, and sometimes the seam allowance is a little bit wider in places, but just kind of tweak it until you get that nice fold. Now we're ready to top stitch. You can start anywhere, and we're going to be stitching 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and when you sew onto that edge, when you come up and sew that 1/8 of an inch, it will hopefully sew into that bias tape. If it goes off just a little bit, that's okay. That's why we sew it in this manner, so that the back side sometimes doesn't quite line up all the way. If you want more control, I personally, and I'm an odd duck, but I would probably enjoy just sewing this side on by hand using a slip stitch. So I might do that while I watch a program or something, just because I enjoy that. But otherwise, you can just top stitch that, and we'll do that now. I'm going to change my stitch length again to a 3 for top stitching. And I'm going to hold that top thread for the first few stitches. Now my presser foot has a little red line right there. That'll give me that 1/8 inch seam allowance. And you can also move your needle position to the left or right to get that 1/8 of an inch seam allowance that you need. When you get all the way around, back stitch. Isn't that just cute? After using the changing mat, you can just fold it in half again, fold it in thirds, and stuff it in your diaper bag. So make up a few. Add some burp cloths. I have a tutorial showing you how to make these fun things. And you've got such a fun baby gift. I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. Thanks so much for watching. If you're liking my content, make sure you give it a thumbs up, like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and click on that bell so that you can be notified when I put new fun projects up. You don't want to miss out on anything. You can find other ideas and projects on my website, youmakeitsimple.com. I have patterns there and other things that you might find enjoyable. Have a wonderful day, have fun sewing, and we'll see you in the next tutorial.